This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening from. Have you been watching the World Cup? I certainly have been. There's fantastic games, and I'm really looking forward to the pressure games that come now with the knockout stages starting tomorrow. And the players and the coaches, their mental toughness is really put to the test. And on this theme, today's episode, I chat with John Nassoori, freelance writer and sports journalist for BBC Sport and The Guardian here in the UK. We go on to discuss some of his research into football or soccer psychology. John has spoken to a number of people at the elite end of professional football on their perceptions of sports psychology and different people who work in the lower echelons of football. We go on to chat about mental health, naturally mental toughness in football, difference between a sports psychologist and other people who are working in football who often get labelled sports psychologists, how sports psychology is currently used in football, and what the future holds for the domain. Enjoy. Hi, John. It's great to meet you. Would you be able to explain to the listeners a little bit about your background and your interest in football psychology?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem, David. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. So I'm a freelance journalist my focus is very much on the use of psychology in football. So I spent the last couple of years talking to players, coaches, psychologists from across the game at all levels about the use of psychology in football. And yeah, it led me to have some really, really interesting conversations with people from kind of as far afield as kind of Wickham and Zagreb, which I'm sure we'll kind of get into. So that's been a fantastic journey over the last kind of 24, 36 months.
It certainly sounds it. Well, do you want to share a little bit more about where that interest came from?
Yeah, sure. So actually, it was a conversation with my wife a few years ago, actually. So I trained as a journalist and I was thinking about what I'd kind of like to focus on and writing about after kind of spending a few years writing about kind of various topics. And we're having a discussion and she just said, I think maybe Dele Alli or Heung-min Son at the time was injured. And she just said, I never read about kind of the impact it has on their kind of mental health in any detail. And as someone who's kind of watched and played the game for kind of an embarrassingly long period of time, I was kind of equally embarrassed to kind of say that, that was the case as well. I kind of read a lot of articles about tactics, about the physical side of the game, but there isn't a lot on psychology. So I started to kind of look into it, and the more I looked into it, the kind of more interested I became. And I just think, as I said, it's a topic that's kind of, when it is looked at, it tends to be looked at a quite high level. So read about players being resilient or competitive or focused. There's not a lot that kind of goes beyond that. And I think as we've seen with tactic, once you actually kind of start to kind of explain some of these concepts in kind of relatively simple, kind of easy to understand terms, I think people do become interested in them actually. And so I think, there's a real open door there with psychology. I think as we've kind of talked about off air, I think, the topic that kind of lends itself to the more human stories the game has to offer. And I think, there's a lot there from my point of view as a journalist.
Yeah, it's true. I bet if you go through every episode of Match of the Day for the last 5 years, there'll be some terminology, whether it's motivation, commitment, confidence, that will even be mentioned in pretty much every single program, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I was having a conversation the other day actually with the current player, and he was making exactly the same point. He said that 95% of the players that he speaks to, if you ask them what's the kind of essential ingredient that's made you a professional footballer, they'll always refer firstly to the psychological traits. So they'll always talk about things like resilience, or ability to with linked to that ability to kind of withstand pressure and competitiveness, and that's the first thing they'll refer to before skill or kind of strength and or kind of physicality or technique or anything like that. It'll be the kind of mental side that they refer to first.
Yeah, I know. I certainly see it with clients and people who get in touch. The common thread seems to be the vast majority can perform quite consistently in training, But then, as you say, under pressure in competitive situations and matches, it can be very, very different.
Yeah, and I think that's where the role of so the psychologists. I mean, obviously that there's so much to it, but that's one of the areas where kind of the role of a psychologist kind of really comes into play. But I mean, for me, it's been, as I said, kind of really interesting over that kind of last 2 to 3 years to just realise how broadly the kind of concept psychology is applied across football. I mean, as coaches and psychologists that have been running workshops for parents on communication with their kids, right the way through to kind of neuroscientists that are using brain imaging to kind of look at players' kind of cognitive ability. So for me that's been such an eye opener. Again, it's kind of we talked about. I think maybe that's something that is a little bit underappreciated. Both I think within the game, potentially among kind of coaches, certainly coaches, I think, and players, but also fans. I think that's that's an area where hopefully by kind of talking about some of the stories in kind of an easy to understand way, that there's a kind of way of communicating with the supporters that kind of really kind of gives them an understanding of what psychology is in a sporting setting is all about.
Yeah, I'm just trying to put my fan hat on and just think about what actually happens in the ground. And I suppose fans are quite easy to play the blame game, aren't they? Really, if a player's not performing, then they're sort of straight on them, and there's no real understanding of why it is that they're not performing.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting, actually, isn't it? I mean, that kind of going on one side, and actually, when you talk to a lot of supporters, they'll speak quite kind of articulately about, how a manager's gone from 3-5-2 to 4-3-3 or kind of whatever. And I wonder why that in such kind of eloquent way. But when you talk about players' loss of confidence, you don't maybe want to have that conversation in kind of greater detail. And I honestly think that's kind of one down to just the amount of content there is now that is focused purely on kind of one area of the game, which is tactics. But also I think, but also the kind of the lack of willingness to talk quite openly about some kind of quite sensitive issues sometimes. And I think it would be great if we could get to a point, and I do think this is happening more and more, where we can have conversations about mental health and psychological performance issues that are more detailed. Because I think, as I said, some of the concepts are quite kind of easy to understand. I think it's just about having that conversation.
Yeah, I'm just going to take you back to that tactical bit you mentioned there. Obviously, that's widely talked about. And really, when you strip it back, if say a coach played a 4-3-3 system for a period of time and then they changed it to three at the back, and maybe one player in particular is like really adversely affected, it can be so many different things, really. It could be, right, okay, so they're playing out of position and they're not comfortable with that. It could be the communication aspect isn't, I suppose their role isn't communicated clearly. Could be just that they've got such a fixed mindset about playing a certain position and that they're not willing to be flexible. There's so many factors involved. Would you agree?
Oh, completely. And I think that's the reason sometimes we kind of, certainly speaking as someone that also supports a club, I completely understand why people default to, well, that's a result of a switch in formation, rather than kind of digging a little bit deeper. It is a really complex issue, and often we don't have the information to hand, kind of do anything other than speculate. Do you think that, do you think there is room, even if we haven't got kind of the information readily to hand, kind of conversations that kind of go beyond, well, he's rubbish or he's not had a great game because of a switch in formation, and then kind of almost ignoring kind of most of the other aspects that potentially play a more kind of important role in the player's performance?
Yeah. You also mentioned there really about players showing their vulnerability, essentially. How much do you think ego in football plays a part there?
Oh, a huge amount. A couple of things on that. I think when you speak to people across the game, I remember having a chat with a psychologist, towards the back end of last year. He was talking about players that he's seen, in a game, kind of during a match, kind of talking about the amount of money that they earn as bragging rights in front of other players. But I think you're right. There's quite often, and again, I've spoken to a couple of players about this. Quite often, that's the front. There's one psychologist I spoke to who said, when she hears stuff like that, she sees vulnerability. She sees fragility, and I think that is a topic that hopefully will kind of start to become talked about a bit more widely. I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think you're starting to see with the kind of the emergence of players of a younger generation, these topics being discussed a little bit more freely than they once were, which is really good to see. And I also think that there is, I kind of mentioned the fact that psychology is often overlooked, but I think you're starting to see kind of discussions about this, within the media kind of go on, even if some of them are at quite a high level, to a greater extent than there ever used to be. So I think for a couple of reasons there, hopefully, we'll start to see that kind of distinction between vulnerability and ego. We'll start to see that kind of less of a kind of, uncertainty.
Yeah, as you say, the fact that some players have certainly spoken out about mental health troubles, and the fact that they are working with psychologists can only be a good thing. I wonder, though, if the fact that players are, well, generally, they're going to be late teens, in their 20s, early 20s, and like a high number in the squads. I just wonder if the fact that they're not particularly mature also has an impact on the way they view the profession. Just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, actually. I certainly think the kind of fact that, there's kind of regulated psychology provision at an academy level, or certainly with the kind of, level one academy clubs anyway, I certainly think that kind of ensures that there's at least a familiarity with the topic and psychologists as practitioners from kind of a young age. So, at least, I suppose in one sense, at least that means that, if you're going into the first team, even if from my point of view, completely paradoxically, at that point, your kind of psychology provision is no longer regulated and it's no longer mandatory, at least that you've had that kind of experience. I also think there, again, speaking to players across the game, I think the fact that you're starting to see some players now that have really had experience of working with a psychologist go into management and coaching roles, I think that again could potentially help, the profession's a bit more embedded within coaching teams, for example, and certainly kind of within the backroom staff.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I'm quite intrigued to see where it all goes in 10, 15 years time, because I suppose one of my worries is when you mentioned there about like kids and how obviously with the EPPP psychology is seen as mandatory, but a lot of clubs will see it as a tick box exercise. They might see a psychologist once a month to put on some sort of workshop. There's not that sort of real personal connection there. So my worry is that a lot of these players that are in academies that are in the tick box academies, if you like, that are coming through don't really place much of a value on sports psychology.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. I spoke to Richard Dobson, he's the Wickham assistant manager, who's kind of one of the first coaches to go on the FA's psychology course about this. And he made exactly that point. He said that, kind of to use his words, he said that clubs were ticking boxes and, we're essentially playing the system, again, to kind of use his words, paying psychologists peanuts, basically, to kind of go in and do it because they had to. I think that is a legitimate concern. I think in an ideal world, that EPPP regulation, that the wording attached to that regulation would be a lot tighter. Definitely think there's scope there to make sure that the provision is more extensive and is also applied by fully trained, fully qualified psychologists as well. It's definitely something that could be looked at. I suppose, like, from an optimist point of view, I was kind of trying to look at it with a kind of chink of light, and because I think speaking to psychologists and coaches quite a lot of the time, sometimes you can kind of get into that kind of vicious circle. It can sometimes be a bit of a downbeat conversation, and I think it's important to kind of look at some of the things that are at least established and try and work on, and to kind of try and work on those, whilst, as you said, not kind of diminishing the fact that there's a hell of a lot to do yet before the game really kind of takes this issue seriously.
Yeah, you mentioned there about fully qualified, and I know this is a bugbear for many sports psychologists who've spent what, 40,000-50,000 pounds plus. Obviously the route is you have a degree which takes 3 years. The master's degree could be 1 to 2 years. Then you have a supervised practice period which will be a further 2 years, up to 4 years. So it's a long old journey to get there. The big bugbear is obviously the mind coach, the mental skills coach. Yeah, I'm just wondering what thoughts and what conversations you've had to people about the sort of mental performance coach or the mind coach.
It's a very contentious issue. People have very kind of strong opinions on this. I think the first thing to say is that if you've spent, as you said, a hell of a lot of money and potentially a decade training to be a qualified psychologist, I completely understand the vehemence that you would have in protecting that, ensuring that title is protected. I think there's an awful lot to do. We kind of touched on it. There's an awful lot to do to make sure that coaches and those in charge of recruiting psychologists at clubs understand exactly what a psychologist does and what the difference is between a qualified psychologist and an unqualified psychologist. Because again, speaking to people, I don't think that level of understanding is there. I think that needs to improve. I think with the kind of mind coaches, I had a conversation with someone about this actually, who, was a mental performance coach, and he hadn't gone through that process in a different country, to be fair. So I'm not exactly sure what the regulatory framework is over there. And it was actually a really constructive conversation, because he came back to an article that I'd written expressing concerns about the use of unregulated psychologists, and made the point that certainly in his experience, he felt there was a role for both, and felt that in some instances there were psychologists that he'd worked with that hadn't potentially had the experience of kind of, again, to use his kind of terminology, kind of, working that closely with coaches and, working that closely with players. So I think, really kind of constructive conversation. I think if we can get to a place where we're having those kind of conversations, I think hopefully we'll be in a situation where we can kind of move things forward, unless there's some drastic changes. And from people I've spoken to, I can't really see this coming anytime soon. I think people are going to kind of have to coexist for a while. So I think it's just about kind of understanding where people kind of add value, potentially.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I'm not one of those bitter sports psychologists. I think the way I see it is, the mind coach or the mental skills coach, whatever you want to call them, they do bring a lot of other skills in some cases. So someone, okay, may have been an ex-professional footballer. They've gone on to do a master's degree. They've other courses. There might be a coach who's done a master's degree. Could be an executive coach who's got an interest in football and who's spent an age getting qualified. So I think people have got to be a little bit careful in getting stuck and criticizing completely, because, they have lots of ranges of experience and skills that they can bring to the party.
I think that whilst on the one hand, again, I've spoken to people that have said players they worked with have been put off using, mental health support because of experiences they've had with unregulated psychologists. Completely kind of accept the need, as we talked about earlier, for kind of better understanding of what a psychologist is on the club side, enforcement of regulation, at academy level, for example. I think we also, as we were just talking about, we also have to kind of be wary of just looking at this in kind of purely black and white terms, because I think to say broad brush that any psychologist out there who doesn't have, again, kind of think about this globally, who doesn't have a regulation attached to their provision is damaging a player's mental health, I think that's too broad brush. I think, you do really kind of have to be aware of exactly what's going on. But as I said, if I were in the shoes of someone that had trained for 10 years and had spent that much money qualifying, again, not begrudging anyone that has a more vehement opinion on it than that.
I'll add as well, you're talking about someone who's trained for 10 years there, and it could be that they've just trained for 10 years and they're purely have a focus and an interest, and they have the qualifications to back that up in performance only. Just because they're a psychologist doesn't mean that they will be necessarily, qualified to deal with mental health or well-being. So again, it's looking at counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, that they would deal with more on the mental health side of things, but often they're also qualified as sports psychologists. So it's quite a muddy pathway, or whatever you want to call it, for people to recognize they've certainly got to do their homework.
It really is. You picked up a point there I'll touch on briefly, actually, which is, I spoke to a clinical psychologist a few weeks ago who was, making that exact point. I think, actually, he's saying that, okay, even if you go down the route where clubs are mandated to use a psychologist that's been through one of the approved training routes and is registered, if that person is a sports psychologist, because that's the protected term, are they necessarily, in his eyes, are they necessarily trained, as you were saying, to kind of deal with mental health issues in the way that a clinical psychologist would be? So it's a complex issue, and that's why I think kind of reducing it to if they're not regulated, there's no role at all for them within the game, I think is probably painting things a little bit too kind of black and white.
Yeah. The name of the podcast it's called Demystifying Mental Toughness. So let's just move towards that. What would your definition of mental toughness be in a football sense?
That's a really good question, actually. So when I think of mental toughness, I tend to kind of think of resilience. And I think when we're talking about resilience from research and just kind of my kind of own stamp, I kind of think about that as, the ability to withstand pressure in a way that it ensures that that person maintains their kind of mental well-being and performance levels. If you think about it like that, I think that is a concept that is kind of will probably be kind of fairly familiar to most people, where it resonate with most people. I think the thing that is important, I did want to just touch on with this, is that a lot of supporters potentially, again, I'll include myself in this, up until the last 24 36 months where I start kind of looking at this in a bit more depth, I tend to think about that as a mental toughness or resilience as a fairly kind of static issue that's kind of completely dependent on that person. And I just think, but I think you take an example like Dele Alli, some of the stuff that's been written about him over the last couple of years has just been, I think kind of fairly outrageous, actually. And I think the reason for that is because, generally speaking, completely ignores what's going on around him. I think if you look at, he's been kind of criticised for not being kind of particularly mentally tough, for lacking motivation, for example. Actually, if you look at the change in his environment from a situation where, he was working with Mauricio Pochettino at Spurs, a manager that was renowned across the game for kind of instilling this really challenging but supportive environment. You take that and then you move him on 5 managers in 2 years to a situation at Everton, something where he's on loan with a fairly inexperienced manager. I just think it's no wonder that his performance and maybe his mental well-being suffered slightly. What do you expect? I think any of us would be challenged to kind of maintain performance levels that with that kind of swing in your kind of circumstances. So I think for me that's the thing that I kind of I think it's kind of important to highlight, is that there's a lot going on around a footballer's life that we're not privy to, and you've really got to take that into account when you're talking about stuff like this.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, when you're talking about the Dele Alli, as you say, there's been about 5 managers there. He's played various different positions. He had injuries. I'd imagine he'll get stuck in the past, probably viewing himself where he was a few years ago at times, and the emotions that come out with that are probably anger and frustration. He'll probably compare himself with some other players who have gone on to reach high levels, and now he could be comparing himself with a lot of the Tottenham players who are doing well. And as you say, you just don't know what's going on in the background in his home life as well, thrown into the mix. It's really, really complex.
Yeah, and I think that kind of ties into this, this idea that quite often we end up, I remember speaking to Mike Calvin, another kind of journalist, about this. He kind of said, basically, in quite a lot of the dialogue that we have about football is certainly, if you're talking about the kind of commentary that you see on kind of mainstream sports channels, that quite often footballers are basically widgets. It's kind of this idea that they're just commodities, and really that there's not a lot of interest in kind of talking about some of the reasons behind their kind of ability to perform. So I just think, again, it kind of goes back to that point we were making right at the start, which is that's a really rich source of discussion. So hopefully we can kind of start to have those conversations more frequently.
Yeah, the reason for the name of the podcast, Demystifying Mental Toughness, actually is partially to do with that, to help people recognize that mental toughness isn't actually fixed. It can be something that's developed, because often people misunderstand it. The other thing is you've got the whole sort of male macho ego thing, where people think only men can be mentally tough. I wondered as well, something that gets bandied about a lot in football is the fact that people are mentally weak, which really bothers me. It's not a nice use of language, if you like. Just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, completely concur with that. In fact, actually, there's a podcast I listen to quite frequently, and that term was used on the podcast the other day, and I kind of winced a little bit, because it's usually it's very sophisticated in the kind of the conversations that it has about kind of mental health issues. It goes back to that point that I think certainly when we're kind of talking, online, and certainly kind of various social media channels and on shows that need to kind of talk about football fairly quickly and in fairly kind of stark terms, I understand that sometimes you'll need to get the root of a point very quickly, and sometimes people will kind of slip up and use terms like that. I suppose, if you have a show that's going on for an hour about the weekend's football, and goes back to the point we talked about it, and 50 minutes of it is devoted to tactics, and maybe sporadically you mentioned kind of the players' lack of confidence during that, it's kind of no surprise that you'll see those terms used, because there just isn't the emphasis on, okay, let's explore that a little bit more. What's really behind his lack of confidence or lack of motivation? Because when you get to that level, certainly the people that are on these shows, they've been there, they've seen it, they've done it, so I think you can kind of get to a point where they quiz them enough about these issues, then actually, hopefully, a little bit more educated debate. I didn't see it, but I'm sure there was something. I'm sure that on Monday Night Football, there was a segment involving Carragher and Neville a few weeks ago. Might speak out of turn here, but during which they actually did talk about lack of confidence. I think they actually started to kind of go into a bit of depth on that issue. But the very fact that is suddenly a huge talking point on Twitter kind of backs up my point, which is that should be commonplace, I think, in my eyes. And it's weird, I think, that it's not. But there we go. That is football to some extent as well.
Yeah, well, maybe that will change in the future, which we'll wait and see. With regards to the future, I know one of the articles you've written, you mentioned about David Ancelotti mentioning that he felt that every footballer may well have a psychologist in future. I just wondered what your thoughts are about the field and its growth.
Yeah, I think he's made that was such an interesting point, and I think he was kind of speaking about elite footballers in particular, because certainly if you're thinking about a player in, I don't know, League Two, for example, can understand maybe if in terms of kind of income that is not a possibility. I think he was talking kind of about at elite level you'd expect the way that things are going, whereby players have their own strength and conditioning coach, their own chef. You kind of expect in his eyes for that to apply more and more to mental health and performance. And he said that there are a few players at Real Madrid that already do have their own psychologists. Again, probably kind of no surprise. I think the interesting point that he touched on, though, is that if that's the route that the game is going to go down, I think you do have to start really kind of then looking at some of the regulations that are in place and kind of start to think about, okay, well, what does this mean? If increasingly players are using their own psychologists, then do we have to do more to educate players on what a psychologist does? What kind of support they should be looking for and shouldn't be looking for? Because there is a bit of a risk there. They get support that isn't particularly kind of productive for them. So I think that is, an issue that might come to the fore. And I suppose maybe another way of kind of countering that would be to look at, maybe mandating the use of psychologists at a senior level within the professional game as well. If you said every club in the Premier League and Championship has to employ a full-time psychologist, we're talking about, I don't know, say if you lose one player from a squad, 30, to employ a full-time psychologist. I just think it's interesting that, that if you look at it in those terms, it's not that difficult to kind of envisage. That said, I think we're quite a long way from that, unfortunately. I'm not sure there'll be any changes that too soon.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the elite and the salary of the top Premier League players and then the annual salary of the psychologist. It's probably about 4 days a week.
Sorry, yeah, I should stress that I was kind of I was thinking more about. I was thinking more probably about a championship player than agreed.
But yeah, I suppose I'm quite intrigued. If you look back 10, 15 years ago and strength and conditioning support, performance analysts, nutrition, all these sort of types of people involved in football, there was some, but now there's an awful lot. It'll be very interesting to see if we have clubs who are like one Premier League club I know who has 6 psychologists involved. If every club's going to be like that, time will tell. Anyway, yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation, John. We could talk about this for a while longer, I can tell. Are you able just to share 3 takeaways for the listeners based on what we've talked about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first one would be just on that point that talked about, that kind of potential tension between, personalization of psychology and regulation. I think that's something to just kind of stay tuned on. I think that's something that's going to be kind of more frequently talked about. I think the other thing is I'd encourage, again, wherever people can to try and make sure that, you have kind of nuanced, conversations about this. And most people that I speak to do and are really kind of educated. But I just think the more that we have people out there talking about this subject in kind of the way that it deserves, I think that's the way you change the kind of conversation as a whole. And then, kind of thirdly, I'd say, from my side, I hope that there'll be more people kind of, writing about this. And I think the media kind of has something to as a journey to go on here as well in terms of how it talks about the issue. I think it's starting, but again, I think it's there are a few writers out there that are doing some fantastic work, but I think there's a lot more that could be done on that front.
Interesting. Whereabouts can the listeners find you should they want to get in touch?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at John Nassoori, or if the listeners kind of want to kind of view from my side of the fence on a weekly basis, I run a newsletter called The Mind Room. So if you go to themindroom.substack.com or just Google The Mind Room Substack, then you can go there. There's a whole host of articles there that are available free of charge, and just pop in your email address and sign up.
Excellent. Those details will go in the show notes. It's definitely worthwhile for people to sign up. Yeah, a big thank you for your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dave. It's been a real pleasure.
No, thoroughly enjoyed it. That was an enjoyable conversation with John, which highlights a number of points on where we currently are as a field, that is sports psychology in football. Now, as the podcast is called Demystifying Mental Toughness, I'm going to have a short ramble about mental toughness in football, certainly from a sports psychologist's perspective. Now, based around the 4Cs model created by Professor Peter Clough, where we have commitment, confidence, control, and challenge. When I look back at my journey into the field in 2009, certainly my commitment has been unwavering. To be able to get involved and support players, coaches, teams, I've regularly set myself goals to chat with, to interview, to have a coffee, to have a round of golf with particular people in football, to gain a better understanding of their perception of sports psychology, to understand the lingo more, to understand the challenges that they have, and to educate them, to form and grow relationships, and ultimately build my network. And this has helped me a huge amount. It's helped me gain a number of opportunities in clubs and with players, from the 8-year-old talented academy player who struggles with their emotions, up to the international player who's having a hard time settling in a new club and is getting heavily criticised from the crowd. Then there's the coach who wants to potentially learn more about him or herself and become a better coach. I've helped out in these different cases a number of times to help coach appreciate their strengths more, to recognise traps that they get sucked into when they're dealing with players and support staff. On confidence, I've steadily built my confidence up over time by stretching myself out of my comfort zone. There's certainly been times when it's been knocked. In the early days when people made it very clear that they didn't see the value in sports psychology, that they saw it as a waste of time and the club's money. Thankfully, I'm over that, and I'm able to now throw my ego to one side and not get hurt by these types of comments. I recognise that that's their stuff, essentially. And personally, I've had enough positive results now with clients to recognise that actually comments like that have helped me be more resourceful. And it's certainly helped me build my own mental toughness as a practitioner. One part which I feel clubs really do miss a trick on is the development of interpersonal confidence. I find in my consultancy work with players and coaches, pretty much every session, there's always a small amount of time, or sometimes a large amount of time, where we discuss how they relate to others in the group, how they communicate with other coaches or teammates. If they demand the ball enough, if they encourage teammates or criticise them, if they instruct teammates or stay quiet. Do they hide? Now, I'm starting a project in the new year to find out more about this. I'm looking at presence on the football pitch. And from my understanding so far, interpersonal confidence most definitely plays a big part in this puzzle. Now, on to control, displaying a can-do attitude. I've worked with practitioners who've had this knocked out of them on occasions working in clubs and organisations. And personally, I've been there too, where your values have been compromised so much that you get frustrated. For example, when you really want to make a difference and you see that as a big value and you know you can make a difference, but you just don't get the opportunity despite spending a large chunk of time there. You're just never given the chance despite promises. It can be very, very frustrating to work in this type of environment. Now, lastly, the word challenge springs to mind, which is another measure of mental toughness. And a part of challenge is learning from mistakes, learning from your experiences. And it's something certainly I've had to do to really distance myself and not take things to heart. What I do recognize is people have their reasons for not involving you as a sports psychology practitioner, a sports psychologist. They may be very busy. They might just lack the education around the field. There might be many other stresses in their role, in their lives. And you're just a tiny, small part of the full infrastructure of a club. So it's key to see their frustrations for what they actually are, and your own for that matter. So personally, it's seen me take a sidestep away from getting too involved in club issues, politics, and the culture side, and simply go on to concentrate on one-to-one work with players for the time being, and coaches in a private, confidential way without any possibility of breach of trust, allowing players to simply be themselves or coaches to be themselves, offload their concerns, and then strategically look to help them build their confidence, improve their well-being, develop that can-do attitude, or bounce back from difficulties like if a player's been dropped or released or is having issues with a coach. Now, I'd love to hear from you on what your take on sports psychology and its use in football or soccer is. If you're a sports psychologist or a mental performance coach, please do get in touch. I'd like to interview you and gain your understanding and have a good chat about this. If you're a parent, if you're a coach, if you're a player, and you've got questions about sports psychology and its use in the field, please do email me at info@sport-excellence.co.uk. The email address is in the show notes. In the meantime, enjoy your week and enjoy the knockout stages of the World Cup. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.